I'm Craig Murray. I'm a journalist and activist, and I attended the hearings in the High Court about the prescription of Palestine Action. We're now in a situation where a judicial appeal has been allowed. There will be a judicial appeal, which will be held in November, probably towards the end of November. But the judge refused to suspend the prescription until that date. The refusal to suspend the prescription was based upon secret evidence. The government made no arguments in open court against the suspension of the prescription. It was all done on the basis of secret evidence from the intelligence services, which was heard in closed court, and not even the lawyers of Huda Ammori, the founder of Palestine Action, who's a party to the case, were allowed to know what that secret evidence is. It appears to be, partly from briefings which the Home Office keeps giving to the media, that the secret evidence relates to alleged further offences which Palestine Action may be planning to commit on a large scale, or to foreign funding. But we don't really know exactly. But on the basis of this secret evidence, the judge decided that the potential harm that Palestine Action may do if the prescription were lifted in the interim was greater on what in legal terms is called the balance of convenience than the harm being done by the hundreds and hundreds of people being arrested and having their free speech limited for supporting Palestine as a result of the prescription of Palestine Action. So that's where we are with that at the moment.
Now, you as a former ambassador, and also I think you were legal advisor on maritime law at the Foreign Office. What do you make of the strength of international law in the UK today? Because it's nice to think that it still does mean something if British citizens are committing war crimes or crimes under international law. Does it have any strength, really, Craig, here?
International law has only really had the strength of, the commitment of governments to keep to it and to enforce it where possible. But we've only ever really seen enforcement action of international law on things like the International Criminal Court, where it's only ever been used by the Western powers against their perceived enemies. Nobody went to the International Criminal Court over the illegal invasion of Iraq, for example. And at the moment, the government appears to almost entirely have abandoned international law. One interesting thing, which is a new development, I've never heard it said by government before, is they say that they are unable to decide whether a genocide is happening in Gaza because it will be the courts that eventually decide that. And until the courts decide, then the UK government cannot have an opinion. But that's not, for example, the line they take on Ukraine, where they state that Putin is a war criminal and Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine. And they seem able to take a stance on that without it first going to an international court. And in fact, that's always been the case. They've always taken stances on these things without necessarily being approved by international courts. So that's one example of the way that international law is being set aside, if you like, in the interests of Israel. We also saw in the armaments case where the government was taken to court over the continued supply of parts for F-35s to Israel, the government arguing that international law is not binding on UK domestic legislation, which is a line they've frequently taken. So these are difficult times, and it's not only, of course, on Palestine. We find, for example, that the Refugee Convention is being attacked in the policy on asylum seekers, where we are attempting to remove asylum seekers without their asylum claims being properly heard, contrary to the Refugee Convention. So there's been this general fall-off in respect for the idea of international law, and I fear the very idea is under attack. the genocide in Gaza is a generational event. It's an epoch-making event which is going to set the tone for decades to come. And it shows a complete lack of respect of the Western states in particular for international law.
Now, some of the Palestine Action activists that I'm in touch with, they are undergoing very long trials, lots of hearings before the trial. Some of them, of course, are being kept on remand. So this is effectively a form of internment, actually, since there's been no trial. There's only hearings. And the announcement about Palestine Action possibly being funded by Iran and this sort of thing seems to have caused quite a lot of mess in the legal system. So what I'm hearing is that, again, trials are being delayed because Mark Rowley, the the constable of the Metropolitan Police, and Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, the judges have said have possibly prejudiced these trials by their actions. So it's getting a bit messy, Craig.
Yeah, no, I noticed that very definitely. I mean, you have, as a journalist, to be very careful what you say about an upcoming trial which is going to be heard, in particular when it's going to be heard by a jury, because you can prejudice the jury by explaining the guilt or innocence of the party in advance and publishing that. But Mark Rowley, in particular, and also Yvette Cooper, have been very open in stating that weapons were used, that axes and sledgehammers were used against the police, as though that is a fact in the upcoming trials in the cases that are centred on Bristol. So that plainly is going to prejudice the jury. And in fact, if I did that, if I were to publish, that is completely and utterly untrue. In fact, these were being used merely to damage the machinery, and the fact that somebody was holding a sledgehammer to damage machinery at the time he was attacked by the police does not mean he was using a sledgehammer to attack the police. You're in danger of being found in contempt of court for publishing that. And certainly Mark Rowley, if he were a normal individual, has almost definitely gone to lengths that would be found in contempt of court for having prejudiced the trial. I don't see how a fair trial can go ahead when all this nonsense has been talked about, secret plans, about vicious attacks on people, about funding by Iran. It plainly will have prejudiced trials.
And what about this business of internment by the back door? Do you think that's effectively what's going on or not?
Yeah, I think the refusal to grant bail is plainly a ratcheting up by the state pressure, because people can be kept in jail, and they are being kept in jail till 2027 or 2028, awaiting trial. So you can do 2-3 years in prison before and then be found not guilty by the jury. And we must remember that the large majority of people taking direct action have been acquitted by juries. Many more people have been acquitted than have been convicted, because despite the efforts of the state to try to persuade juries to obey the state, it's very hard to find a jury prepared to convict people for attempting to stop a genocide. So, these periods of remand, but putting people who have no criminal record into remand for literally years awaiting trial is absolutely unacceptable. It's also worth stating that this is something which happens to working class people in the UK all the time, unconnected to politics. I was jailed myself for contempt of court and spent time in prison in Edinburgh. And 40% of the prisoners in that jail had not been convicted of anything. They were there on remand awaiting trial. And the average waiting time they were waiting for their trial was 18 months. And I knew two prisoners I knew who were on the same floor as me. One of them was ultimately found not guilty, so he had 18 months in jail for an offence he did not commit. And the second one was found guilty and was fined £75 for a fight in a pub. His eventual punishment was a fine of £75 with no jail sentence. He wasn't sentenced to time served, but he had spent nearly 2 years in jail waiting for his trial. So, we're seeing how awful this is happening to political activists, but we shouldn't forget that this happens to working class people all of the time, and our jails are full of innocent people waiting for their trials.
Now, back in the 1990s, what they called the Plowshares these four women that went into an RAF BAE base, smashed up an aircraft, and they were acquitted. Their defence was that we're stopping a greater crime, and the judge and the jury accepted that. Why is that not the case these days? Because surely, if I see somebody who is attacking somebody else, and I attack them in order to stop them doing that, then I'm not going to be found guilty because what I'm doing is stopping a greater crime. How come this doesn't matter anymore in British law, it seems?
Well, it should be said that there have been acquittals on exactly that basis in the last year. People are still being acquitted on that basis, but the things have been tightened up, and I'm not sure if this is legislative or it's just administrative by judges, but judges are no longer allowing that defence to be stated in court. You are no longer allowed to say, frequently, you are not allowed to say, the judge will rule it out of order if you say, yes, but I did it because of this. This was my motive. Judges are saying that's irrelevant to your guilt or innocence, and all the jury are here to do is to consider guilt or innocence. That may be used in mitigation, and I, the judge, can take that into account in deciding how long a sentence I may give you, but the jury may not allow you to take that into account in deciding your guilt or innocence. Now, juries have, by jury nullification, juries have ignored that instruction frequently, which is why judges are now resorting to refusing to let people say it in the first place. But even then, juries are finding people not guilty because, of course, juries are not stupid. They understand why people are doing things. And so there still is acquittal more often than conviction in these cases. But this, of course, is why Defend Our Juries exists. That's what the organisation Defend Our Juries exists in order to promote, which is the right of juries in law to acquit according to their conscience, which is supposed to be an established legal principle, but which the government is trying very hard to undercut.
Well, the Palestine Action, non-violent direct activists who've been disabling arms factories, drone factories, this sort of thing, how much impact do you think they've had since this genocide began, Craig?
Yvette Cooper claims in the High Court that they have caused hundreds of millions of pounds of loss to the weapons industry. Now then, my expectation is that Yvette Cooper is exaggerating that for the purpose of justifying her prescription. But they've certainly caused significant damage to the weapons industry, and I must say, if they have caused hundreds of millions of pounds to the Israeli-linked weapons industry, I am delighted. That's a fantastic effect. I tend to think that the moral effect is as important as any damage which is done. It's a very effective means of protest, and it was very effective at getting people to understand. People did not know that we have the manufacturing base of much of the Israeli weapons industry in the United Kingdom. People were not aware of that. People are aware of that now. But the campaigning meat of that kind of action in getting the message out there is also very valuable.
Can you say something about what's been happening at the Leonardo? This is another Israeli-linked company in Edinburgh, because it's been the Scottish National Party, for example, have been pretty forthright politically, but it seems that there is no truck with these sort of pro-Palestinian actions going on in Edinburgh at the moment.
Yeah. No, the Scottish National Party have been somewhat fork-tongued. They have been more forthright than the UK government in condemning Israeli actions in Gaza, but that's not a high bar. But at the same time, Scottish Enterprise, which is an arm of the Scottish government, has given hundreds of millions of pounds in public money grants to weapons factories that make arms for Israel, among other customers. So there's quite a dichotomy
sorry, are you saying that's a form of welfare? This is just grants by government?
Yeah, these are enterprise grants, for setting up in zones of high unemployment and those kind of schemes. But money has been given to the weapons industry in Scotland quite extensively, including and specifically two companies which benefit Israel and supply weapons to Israel or weapon systems to Israel. And also, I'm talking of the SNP. Historically, people may remember the boycott of Eden Springs, which was a water company, probably still exists, you don't see it as much anymore, which was a water company which for a while was quite large in the UK, but which was based in the illegal settlements in the occupied territories. And when Eden Springs in Scotland it had a headquarters in Scotland, and it stated that it was suffering a great deal from the boycott movement, and John Swinney, who was Minister of Industry at that time and is now the First Minister, he specifically gave a grant of millions of pounds to Eden Springs in order to compensate them for the damage they were suffering from the boycott movement. So, you just can't trust politicians. We may hear some better words from the SNP at the moment, but they are words.
Okay, so what's been happening at this Leonardo plant? What do they make there? Do you know?
Yeah. Basically, it's electronics, aviation electronics, laser guidance systems, and those kind of things. And there are several aspects of their supply lines which go into F-35 jets and into other equipment which is used by the Israeli military.
And what about the action there?
There's a group called Closed Down Leonardo, which is a specifically Scottish entity. It's not part of Palestine Action, it's important to say. And several times it has taken action against the Leonardo plant. And a couple of months ago, 3 young women rammed the fence of the security fence of the plant in a minibus and then demonstrated on top of a minibus with Palestinian flags. The amount of physical damage they did was actually very limited. There's slight damage to the fence, and that's really the amount of damage. But they were arrested, and as this was immediately following the prescription of Palestine Action, they were treated as terrorists. They were taken to the specialist terrorist holding cell in Govan. They were kept incommunicado for 6 days. We arranged legal representation for them, for example, along with the families. But the police refused to tell them of the legal representation organised for them. And instead, the police only allowed them to go with the duty solicitors. The police refused to give them any messages from any of their families. Even we had family members going to the police station, and they couldn't get any message through to them on for example, the lawyers and other things being done for their support. And they were held and interrogated for 6 days without charge before finally being brought up and charged at Edinburgh Sheriff Court.
We like to think of Scotland as really being sort of almost independent from Britain, but it seems to be kind of almost in lockstep, actually, Craig. Also, we've had this news this week about Netanyahu trying to sack the Attorney General in Israel and actually instructing his cabinet members to ignore all rulings from the Israeli Supreme Court. So it does seem as if there is a sort of falling apart, basically, of the rule of law.
I think that's true. I mean, another thing is the last 2 vessels from the Gaza Freedom Flotilla vessels, which have been intercepted by Israel illegally in international waters. The first one was the Madeleine. I forget the name of the second, something like the Hamdallah. They both flew the British flag. They were both British registered vessels, and the law which applies on board those vessels in international waters is UK domestic law. So the Israelis boarding the ship committed a crime in UK domestic law, as well as a crime in international law in preventing freedom of passage in international waters. And the British government has done nothing whatsoever. It has a legal obligation to intervene. The Metropolitan Police should actually be investigating the Israelis for kidnapping, who took the people off that British flagged ship in international waters. That I used to be the head of the Foreign Office Maritime Section. Believe you me, that is definitely the legal situation. And the British government just refuses to do it because basically the law is what the Zionists want the law to be, irrespective of what it really is. And that, unfortunately, is a situation we've reached where Zionism is distorting the rule not just of international law, but the rule of domestic law as well, as we see with the crazy prescription of Palestine Action.
Do you think there are people within the Foreign Office, in the civil service, that have noticed this?
Oh, undoubtedly, yeah. I mean, 300 current members of Foreign Office staff wrote a letter to David Lammy saying that we are acting in defiance of international law in our continued cooperation with Israel. And the reply which they received from a head of the diplomatic service was to say that if you don't like it, you should consider resigning. But there's enormous unhappiness in the Foreign Office. And, I hear from that. There's still plenty of people who work there, who worked alongside me at various stages. And, I've no doubt there's never been a more unpopular Foreign Secretary than David Lammy. And, people by and large did not go into the Foreign Service in order to be complicit in a genocide. So there's very great unhappiness indeed.
Well, look, Craig, finally, I mean, you clearly know what you're talking about in these matters. How come we haven't seen you recently on the BBC, on ITV, on Channel 4, on Sky News? You don't seem to be being really... I mean, what's going on there, do you think?
Well, I think, again, the editorial bias is enormous. And I think the reason you don't see me there is that I do know what I'm talking about on these matters, and they really don't want people who can speak with authority and experience of the crimes that are being committed in the name of Zionism. I think that's the last people they're going to allow to be exposed on mainstream media, unfortunately.
Well, a lot of people are not trusting anymore. The media, the mass media, the London media in the UK. Anyway, Craig, where can people find and follow you?
You can find my blog on craigmurray.org.uk. That's craigmurray.org.uk. And you can find me on Twitter at craigmurray.org. I'm also on all kinds of different social media, but I never remember all the handles.
Okay. All right, Craig Murray. Thanks very much for joining.